Mr. Slotnick?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Morning.
Council members, Greg Zlotnick with the state and federal contractors. Also, a few what I hope are mainly process-type questions. I don't want to run afoul of Mr. Stevens, certainly. And this has to do primarily, hopefully Mr. Hatchett can answer some of these on the cost analysis, just questions dealing with that and getting more clarity. A basic one, I guess, is, how is that cost analysis developed? I mean, can you kind of walk through, sort of what you're looking at within the plan, and then how you try to determine what the cost impacts are, which I assume is the intent behind it. What is the impact of implementation of the plan? Is that and the regulations within the plan?
Yes. So that's the first. That is laid out in the documents that I know they're long
and tough to pick those nuggets out.
Understood. Essentially, we went through item by item for the consistency process and related parts of that, and then policy by policy, and got the staff together who worked on each of those and did our assessment on a policy by policy basis, and then we okay, what information do we have that's well documented? Not a lot. This is a new thing. So in many cases, policy by policy, we might have done it a little differently. We might have said, okay, do we have any reasonable basis for coming up with a range of let's say, covered actions and the kinds of costs? And so we took that approach for the consistency process, and staff sort of generated based on their understanding, their expectation about what should be the level of effort to comply with that consistency process, and that is what it is. We don't have good evidence of what that's going to take, but it's laid out there, so you can read it. On other policies, it was even more difficult to come up with even a range of costs. So a couple of those, we used some examples to maybe describe the kinds of cost categories that might be incurred. So that's kind of the process. It wasn't a very standardized process.
And from reading through it and your estimates, it was sort of the cost of compliance, if you will, in terms of essentially paperwork, a lot of paperwork and doing assessment.
And that's part of it.
And the assumption is that, as you describe, and there's a point to me on this, sort of following up Don's comment, that you can pass through the costs. Well, certainly the counties, in particular, I would argue, many struggle with their budgets, and in terms of the opportunity cost of finding dollars to comply with this versus maybe other things, I assume that doesn't get rolled in, and that's just something the counties have to deal with. And again, I mean, it's hard to assess, and it may just not be part of economic analyses generally, but I assume that's part of the issue that Don is raising, but that just doesn't get folded in. It's just sort of another requirement. Is that correct?
It's not. That's not what is specifically asked for the fiscal impact analysis. But it's a fair comment.
Right. And then related to that, particularly with probably more with special districts, we now have in place Propositions 218 and was it 26, I believe. And I think you actually allude someplace in the document and say, well, there are some things out there that might constrain the ability to pass through.
Yes.
But sort of an analysis of, can you actually pass through those costs? I mean, it just seems that so you just basically say those are out there as a potential hindrance, but the assumption is that if they can get through them. Is that fair?
All we've done is laid out the potential for passing through the costs. You're right. We did mention that there are local vote hurdles to get over, and that this is a mechanism, and in many cases probably the likely mechanism at which the local agencies will try to pass through those costs.
Okay. Hey, can you speak, and maybe you or Chris, speak to how does OAL look at the cost assessment and the fiscal report? We know, in the workbook it talks about the different criteria it has for looking at the actual regs, clarity, not duplicative, all that kind of stuff. How do they assess this report, and what are the implications of their assessment, I guess? Is it just kind of information they get and they kind of look at it? Or do they have to take a critical eye at this document, and how does that, I don't know if anyone knows.
I'll start.
Box, so.
Well, so that's the Department of Finance that does that, and then they submit. But
so Department of Finance gets this report,
yes,
and they look at it and make some sort of comment to OAL.
That's right. And,
okay.
I don't profess to understand exactly what they have. Some items in the state administrative manual that lists the kind of things that they're looking for. Okay. I believe they're in process. I believe there was a fairly recent law amending the Administrative Procedures Act that directs them to generate, but it's not done yet, to generate regulations. If I'm recalling, I'm kind of out on a limb here.
Regulations,
not being a
regulations dealing with fiscal impact reports to OAL.
Right. But that's not required of them for another year or so, I believe.
Okay.
I can check on that.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Then the other two more issues. You talked about, and understandably, that the assumption was that WRP1 essentially calls on meeting current law in many respects, so the costs of meeting current law are not your obligation to deal with. I'm paraphrasing, but that's fair. However, that related to the water management planning that's now required. However, the reduced reliance implications of WRP1 and potential reduction in exports, which are commented or mentioned throughout the EIR and the plan.
And the statute.
Well,
and
reduced reliance is, reduced exports are never mentioned. But they are in the document, that's an implication of the plan. Those are new, that's a new criterion, essentially, or new regulation, or new impact. How is that reflected? It doesn't seem to be reflected in the cost analysis, other than to say we assume that those supplies will be backfilled through either conservation or new infrastructure, which themselves have a lot of economic impacts. When that happens, conservation, of course, reduces your income, and you still have your fixed costs. So that issue, does that need to be assessed or not?
Well, I think we're getting over into a point where staff probably needs to weigh in.
Well, Mr. Zlotnick, if the contractors are urging the council to second-guess the Bay Delta Conservation Plan on cost implications and all that, you ought to say that directly.
That's not the point, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to understand.
Isn't exports related to the Bay Delta Conservation Plan?
Yes, but I'm trying to understand the cost analysis that's done for your document, and whether or not the assumption that seems to be that you just sort of are dealing with current law, whether that is truly covering what you're describing. And I just, again, I might be stepping over into comment, and then we'll send that in, and that's okay. It just sort of dawned on me hearing the conversation today, which is very helpful, that basically the idea is under current law you got to do this anyway, so it's not our obligation to assess that. I understand that. Anyway, but related to that is, as I said, it seems to be the assessment is done on compliance. Do these cost documents, are they supposed to deal with the implications, shall we say, of noncompliance or of enforcement of your regulation? So, for example, let's say that there's a water transfer that's proposed that is appealed to there's someone sends in the consistency stuff or doesn't send it in or says it's consistent, there's an appeal, etc. And the council says, nope, not consistent. And because of the limited time windows that transfers can occur and whatever, it can't happen. Is there an economic impact of that is supposed to be looked at?
That is described as potential consequences of the consistency process. You have to agree could be that the local sponsor would have to go back and make changes, and those might be costly.
But
But
in an
in terms
instance where
of
they just
dollars,
can't do it,
well, and that's another case.
that's just a
But
different
in
kind
terms
of
of what
cost.
that would cost, there's
Okay.
no reasonable
Right.
way to come up with a number on that.
Okay, fair enough. The last comment I just have, Chris, is for the hearing on the 24th. Are there going to be formal protocols for that in terms of time of testimony, number, how is?
Yeah.
I mean-
Well, I think that we have, the council has discretion
Sure.
to
Or is it going to be
set
kind
that
of
up.
like general public comment? If you want to come up with some major bullets and just.
Well, I think typically the council's been very flexible, but I think there's, with the assumption that stakeholders are going to be reasonable with regard to the time, I think
Okay.
the council will probably request stakeholders that if they can put things in writing,
Sure.
that they do that, and that when they present orally, that they not just repeat what they've already submitted in writing. But I think for the most part, there'll be very flexible rules that I'll lay out ahead of the
Okay,
hearing.
and that's fine. We'll
Yeah.
obviously be submitting something in writing. I guess then the last question is there an expectation or the potential, we'll say, that at the hearing on the 24th, since you will have closed the public comment period on the 14th, theoretically and hopefully the staff will have been able to provide some feedback to the council on the comments received, and there's also going to be that opportunity you're describing for a hearing, another supplemental hearing. But that is it at that meeting, at that hearing on the 24th, where any changes, if the council deemed to make changes in that hearing, be primarily just on the regulations, right? Because that's what the hearing's about.
Yeah, that hearing's going to be primarily on the regulations.
So if there was a decision to make any potential change, would occur at that hearing?
Probably not. What we'll
Okay.
do is we'll come back. We won't be in a position as staff to have provided our input, suggestions, feedback. We want to make sure that the council
Sure.
has considered all the comments. I mean, that's required
Okay,
under
so
the
you
law.
might reschedule something if the
Well, it's
council
not
decided.
it's not going to be rescheduled, but as Cindy alluded to,
Schedule.
I think we're looking at the end of March to actually present to the council kind of findings on the three processes, and that's going to be the point
And
where
the results of the hearing and all that.
Yeah,
So
the
there'll be-
results of the
okay,
hearing
so that's
will
a
be built
subsequent
in.
meeting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So look towards the end of March.
Okay,
Uh-huh.
great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Last request.